friends, and welcome to another episode of The Blunt Writer. It's been almost a week since I last uploaded a video, and that's because I've been trying to get in the flow of being in quarantine. And I guess it's really tough because I think in theory we have all this time to write. But who's really writing, guys? Are you writing? Because it feels like there's this vast ocean of time right now, and all this time to introspect and think about life and think about all the amazing things that we could create. And yet, for a lot of us, it's a very, very hard time to put cohesive thought together and make something out of it and create a story. I'm teaching an online workshop right now, and I think, I've purposely, because it's psychologically impacting a lot of people, just being in quarantine. But then people who are in quarantine already were so privileged because and I'm speaking again from India, where this was such an unprepared, unprecedented move of locking down the entire country, where at least a good 40% of this country are poor and are migrant workers and people who have just been caught up in this and are on the roads literally trying to get to a safe place. So I think, even taking in this information, even though we're not experiencing the real horrors of it, is also psychologically impacting, and a lot of ideas about the world and how we were living before is really coming to the forefront. And it's a lot to process emotionally, and I do believe that a lot of this will come to us at different spurts and different times where we feel really empowered to write what we're feeling. Anyway, so going back to the workshop that I'm doing, so I said that let's do a lot of writing exercises that are kind of based in how we're feeling right now. But again, when you're writing about anything, and even if it's something as globally what do you call it, that's happening right now, that everybody can relate to, resonating on almost a global level, it still doesn't mean that whatever you write, just because it's about the quarantine or the COVID or what's happening right now, it's not enough for somebody to say, yeah, I'm going to read this story, whether it's an essay, whether it's fiction, whether whatever it is. You still have to connect with somebody, and you still have to bring an element of humanity to connect to a specificity about your life. And I think I brought this up at workshop today, and I said, I don't care if the story is about you and your newfound relationship with a spice mix or like sambar masala. Whatever it is, that's the specifics that we're looking at to find and look at humanity through. And so whatever you're saying has to have a certain kind of scene build up, a certain kind of environment, a certain kind of emotion that you're working with, that is going to obviously add up to the larger worldview. So today I am actually trying to answer a question that I got from one of my friends, who happens to be a professor, an amazing professor, an amazing writer, especially in the nonfiction capacity. She writes some amazing personal essays and general essays that are very, I think, uplifting, at the same time very radically changing and pushing you and challenging you to look at your worldview in context to India, and just someone who shows her vulnerability in a lot of ways. And her name is Vijeta Vij, and she goes by Lola Ram on Twitter and Instagram. And she, so go and follow her and try to look up her work. I will link some of her essays in the description of this video. So I hope you will read those. And so she asked me this question saying, well, how do you write a story if you have something in your head, if you have the story in your head, but it's coming out all wrong? And this is a classic question. It's a very good question, because I think a lot of people struggle with this. We have this idea in our head, but then we don't know how it. We try putting it out there, but the amazingness of the idea is just not translating on paper. Because when you look at a paper, I'm like, this sucks so bad. What do I do? Well, what do you do? Well, if you really have this idea, first of all, and you really have the integrity to sit down and do the work and write it, because having an idea is one thing, and then actually having the integrity to sit down and write it out are two very different things. I suffer from this a lot of times. I have an idea, but then I'm so lazy, I will not sit out and write it, and then boom, lost. I've lost a potentially amazing story. But RIP to so many good stories because of my laziness. But then there are people. Much better human beings than I am, who actually have an idea and actually will do the work. And I would like to offer some insight from at least my practice of sometimes successfully working with an idea and actually, playing with that idea in my head to somehow translate onto paper in a way that's coming out right. So the first thing that I wrote down is, well, if you have this idea in your head and you've started writing it and it's just not, it's clunky, or the characters are not making sense, or even if it's a personal essay, it's just not starting with anything that's compelling, because your starting has to be something that is compelling, right? To make the reader invest in your story. Well, it's to backtrack and kind of write, well, what is the core emotion you are working with, right? And then the most important thing is, how are the specifics of the way you're going to tell this story, how is that going to illustrate that emotion? So suppose that emotion is absolute panic. Okay, absolute sudden panic, and you want to somehow bring this idea of somebody being panicked about anything, their state of being, an existential crisis. It's not, the first thing we go to is to write something very direct, and that's exactly what we shouldn't be doing. We should be able to understand a character or what we're trying to say, if it's nonfiction, in a very specific way. So for example, if say a character is walking around in their house, and the first line of the story is, I knew I was in trouble the day I finished a kilo of raw peanuts or groundnuts. Now that gives me a pull, as a reader, because I'd be like, okay, so why are they in trouble? Because they ate that many groundnuts. And as the story builds up, we realize that the person who's eating groundnuts has only eaten groundnuts in their life when something super traumatic has happened, or when something super uncontrollable has happened, and they don't know any other way to cope but with the groundnuts. So therefore, my structure for kind of describing and illustrating that panic is going to be through this character eating groundnuts. So those are the first two things you need to identify. What is the emotion that you are trying to work with in this story or article or essay? And two, how are you going to specifically show this emotion? When I say specifically, it means it's obviously by default unique, because it's coming from your worldview. It's not the idea itself, it's not the emotion. Like the emotion, everybody has panic. The idea, everybody can have the idea about writing somebody having an existential crisis, but it is the specifics in the way this person processes this emotion that is your unique fingerprint as a writer, and that's what I want you to think about. So that's two things that you can do right off the bat to suddenly to get your framework right in mind. Like, okay, so this is a specific way I'm going to work with this emotion, that this is the core of my story, and you start over there. And the last thing that I can give you as a tip for an idea that you have in your head that you can't somehow put on paper or it's coming out wrong is think of it from the reader's perspective for a moment and say, suppose you were going to be this reader of the story that you're going to write. Well, what is the main thing the reader is going to be treated to when they read this? And one of them can be a radically new perspective about life, or where they're, or how they see the world, or learn something that they've never contemplated before. Maybe it's a simple thing of being visually stimulated. The way you describe the environment is got more to do with the narrative plot, or the way that the dynamic of the climax is going to be, or whatever that is. But it's just being visually stimulated, being set inside, steeped inside this place, or maybe they're going to be emotionally stimulated. Maybe your book is just going, your idea or your story is going to be something that is going to push a reader to feel emotions that are maybe all over the place, or maybe cogent in one way, but it's emotionally driven. The other thing is, could your article or story make people uncomfortable? How are they going to make them uncomfortable? What people are going to be uncomfortable? How do you think your readers are going to react with this uncomfortability in context to your story? Because that's going to get your mind working into thinking, well, what is the story going to say? How is it going to affect readers this way? How is it going to make them uncomfortable? What specifics of the story is going to make them uncomfortable or make them resonate and think again and say and relook at something in a very different way? Or maybe the story is just going to offer delight. And when you say delight, that means something enjoyable, something that's in the very present moment that you're reading it and you're feeling light, you're feeling happy. And you have to be careful here, because if you're going to offer just delight, you can quickly get into the territory of just being really cheesy, or being very superficial. So, use feeling light reading with caution, because you can slip into very didactic or moralistic or very like black and white areas of what happiness and lightness means. But if you're still going to offer delight, how are you going to do that? And or you're going to just make the person resonate with you. And when you say resonate with you, that means you have already chosen your demographic of people who are going to resonate with the story arc, the theme, or the content of whatever you're writing. And how are they going to resonate with it? Is it just going to be like, yeah, I get that feeling, I totally know what that is about, or I've had that same exact experience in my life? So what are these things, these qualities that ideally your reader should be getting when they actually read the story from this idea that you can't put out right now, or it's coming out wrong? And honestly, because writing is definitely not something that's I can give you scientific clarity on, these are the best tips that I can give you in terms of trying to understand your own story a little better. And once you feel that, feel these kind of textures that I've talked about, your mind might start to work in different ways and be like, oh, now I know how I'm going to start the story. Oh, now I know what's going to happen in the story. Oh, now I know how I'm going to define this one emotion, or how I'm going to define this character in this really interesting way. And I hope that this is helpful in some way in getting some kind of words to paper, because it's certainly not happening with me. But we will try, and I will check back with you guys next week for another video. In the meantime, if you have any questions that you would like answered on the Blunt Writer, please comment, please ask your questions, and I will definitely take them into consideration for my next video. Stay tuned, take care, stay safe.